Hi, Steven. Glad to see you here. Whoops. Let me put this on silent so that loud. I know how loud that buzzing sounds when it's on the other end. So I won't let that happen again. Yeah, it's really loud. I know. Sorry, won't happen again. I silenced my phone. Looks like Eric's here, but I don't see a comment yet. I'll wait for that random word that's coming. Unless that's someone else. Ah, Habari. Okay, cool. Yeah, I hate that sound. Okay, so we left off with Voth being surprised with what he thought was just a loot case for his loot that he thought was stolen, but turns out Denna went ahead and took the loot. So he's very relieved that it did not get stolen after all, and she just is a very thoughtlessly thoughtful person. I don't know how else to say that. So now we're on chapter 31, The Crucible. With my loot back in my hands, the rest of my life slid easily back into balance. My work in the fishery was easier. My classes breezed by. Elodin even seemed to make more sense. It was with a light heart that I visited Simmon in the alchemy complex. He opened the door to my knocking and gestured me inside. "It worked," he said excitedly. I eased the door shut, and he led me to a table where a series of bottles, tubes, and coal gas burners were arranged. Sim smiled proudly and held up a short, shallow jar of the sort you use to store face paint or rouge. "Can you show me?" I asked. Sim lit a small coal gas burner, and the flame fanned against the bottom of a shallow iron pan. We stood quietly for a moment, listening to it hiss. "I got new boots," Sim said conversationally, lifting up a foot so I could see. "They're nice," I said automatically, then paused and looked closer. "Are those hobnails?" I asked incredulously. He grinned viciously. I laughed. The iron pan grew hot, and Sim unscrewed the jar, pressing the pad of his index finger into the translucent substance inside. Then, with a little flourish, he raised his hand and pressed the tip of his finger onto the surface of the hot iron pan. I winced. Sim smiled smugly and stood there for the space of a long breath before pulling his finger away. "Incredible," I said. "You guys do some crazy things over here. A heat shield." "No," Sim said seriously. "That's absolutely the wrong way to think about it. It's not a shield. It's not an insulator. It's like an extra layer of skin that burns away before your real skin gets hot." "Like having water on your hands," I said. Sim shook his head again. "No, water conducts heat. This doesn't." "So it is an insulator." "Okay," Sim said, exasperated. "You need to shut up and listen. This is alchemy. You know nothing about alchemy." I made a placating gesture. I know. "Say it then. Say, 'I know nothing about alchemy.'" I glowered at him. "Alchemy isn't just chemistry with some extra bits," he said. "That means if you don't listen to me, you'll jump to your own conclusions and be dead wrong. Dead and wrong." I took a deep breath and let it out. "Okay, tell me." "You'll have to spread it on quickly," he said. "You'll only have about 10 seconds to get it spread evenly onto your hands and lower arms." He made a gesture to his mid-forearm. "It won't rub away, but you will lose a bit if you chafe at your hands too much. Don't touch your face at all. Don't rub your eyes. Don't pick your nose. Don't bite your fingernails. It's sort of poisonous." "Sort of?" I asked. He ignored me, holding out the finger he'd pressed onto the hot iron pan. "It's not like armor gloves. As soon as it's exposed to heat, it begins to burn away." "Will there be any smell?" I asked. "Anything that will give it away?" "No. It doesn't really burn, technically. It simply breaks down." "What does it break down into?" "Things," Simmon said testily. "It breaks down into complicated things you can't understand because you don't know anything about alchemy." "Is it safe to breathe?" I amended. "Yes. I wouldn't give it to you otherwise. This is an odd formula, tried and true. Oh, an old formula, tried and true. Now, because it doesn't transmit heat, your hands will go straight from feeling cool to being pressed up hard against something burning hot." He gave me a pointed look. "I advise you stop touching hot things before it's all used up." "How can I tell when it's about to be used up?" "You can't," he said simply, "which is why I advise using something other than your bare hands." "Wonderful." "If it mixes with alcohol, it will turn acidic. Only mildly, though. You'd have plenty of time to wash it off. If it mixes with a little water, like your sweat, that's fine. But if it mixes with a lot of water, say 100 parts to 1, it will turn flammable." And if I mix it with piss, it turns into delicious candy, right? I laughed. Did you make a bet with Willem about how much of this I'd swallow? Nothing becomes flammable when you mix it with water. Sim's eyes narrowed. He picked up an empty crucible. Fine, he said. Fill this up then. Still smiling, I moved to the water canister in the corner of the room. It was identical to the ones in the fishery. Pure water is important for artificing too. Hello. It's cat time. You're late. Pure water is important for artificing too, especially when you're mixing clays and quenching metals you don't want contaminated. I splashed some water into the crucible and brought it back to Sim. He dipped the tip of his finger into it, swirled it around, and poured it onto the hot iron pan. Thick orange flame roared up, burning 3 feet high until it flickered and died. Sim set down the empty crucible with a slight click and looked at me gravely. Say it. I looked down at my feet. I know nothing about alchemy. Sim nodded, seemingly pleased. Right, he said, turning back to the work table. Let's go over this again. An of glove, yeah, that would work. Or something. No, I don't think it's a good idea for Bernie to groom my cat. I don't know why you said that either, but... anyway, that was the end of that chapter. That was a short one. Chapter 32, Blood and Ash. Well, actually, I forgot to take a sip of water. Right. And now Louie's just going to pass out on my lap. You might not see him again. Leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way through the forest to the north of the university. The pale moonlight filtering through the bare trees wasn't enough to see clearly, but I had made this trip several times in the last span and knew the way by heart. I smelled wood smoke long before I heard voices and glimpsed firelight through the trees. It wasn't really a clearing, just a quiet space hidden behind a rocky outcrop. A few pieces of fieldstone and the trunk of a fallen tree provided makeshift seats. I had dug the fire pit myself a few days ago. It was over a foot deep and 6 across, lined with stones. It dwarfed the small campfire currently burning there. Everyone else was already there. Mola and Fela shared the log bench. Willem was hunkered down on a stone. Sim sat cross-legged on the ground, poking at the fire with a stick. Will looked up as I came out of the trees. In the flickering firelight, his eyes looked dark and sunken. He and Sim had been watching over me for almost 2 whole span. You're late, he said. Sim looked up to see me, cheerful as always, but there were marks of exhaustion on his face, too. Is it finished? He asked, excited. I nodded. Unbuttoning my cuff, I rolled up my shirt sleeve to reveal an iron disc slightly larger than a Commonwealth penny. It was covered in fine sigildry and inlaid with gold. My newly finished gram. It was strapped flat against the inside of my forearm with a pair of leather cords. No, I got the reference, Stephen. It was just kind of a random thing to bring up. It seemed like it to me for some reason. Anyway, a cheer went up from the group. Interesting way to wear it, Mola said. Fashionable in a sort of barbarian raider way. It works best in contact with skin, I explained. And I need to keep it out of sight, since I'm not supposed to know how to make one. Practical and stylish, Mola said. Simmon wandered over and peered at it, reaching out to touch it with a finger. It seemed so small. Ah! Sim cried out as he jumped backward, wringing his hand. Black damn! He swore, embarrassed. I'm sorry, it startled me is all. Kissed and Crail, I said, my own heart racing. What's the matter? That's a new one. Kissed and Crail. Have you ever touched one of the Arcanum Guilders? He asked. The ones they give you when you become a full Arcanist? Arcanist? I still don't know how to pronounce that word. I nodded. It sort of buzzed, made my hand go numb like it had fallen asleep. Sim nodded toward my gram, shaking his head. It feels like that. Surprised me. I didn't know the Guilders acted as grams, too, I said. Makes sense, though. Have you tested it? Willem asked. I shook my head. It seemed a little strange for me to test it myself, I admitted. You want one of us to do it? Simmon laughed. You're right, that's perfectly normal. I also thought it would be convenient to have a physiker nearby. I nodded in Mola's direction, just in case. I didn't know I was going to be needed in my professional capacity tonight, Mola protested. I didn't bring my kit. It shouldn't be necessary, I said as I brought a block of sympathy wax out of my cloak and brandished it. Who wants to do the honors? There was a moment of silence, then Fela held out her hand. I'll make the doll, but I'm not sticking it with a pin. Venata, Willem said. Simmon shrugged. Fine, I'll do it, I guess. I handed the block of wax to Fela, and she began warming it with her hands. "Do you want to use hair or blood?" she asked softly. "Both," I said, trying not to let my growing anxiety show. "I need to be absolutely sure of it if I'm going to be able to sleep at night." I pulled out a hat pin, pricked the back of my hand, and watched a bright bead of blood well up. "That won't work," Fela said, still working the wax with her hands. "Blood won't mix with wax. It'll just bead up and squish out." "And how did you come by that tidbit of information?" Simmon teased uneasily. Fela flushed, ducking her head a little, causing her long hair to cascade off her shoulder. "Candles. When you make colored candles, you can't use a water-based dye. It needs to be powder or oil. It's a solubility issue. Polar and nonpolar alignments." "I love the university," Sim said to Willem on the other side of the fire. "Educated women are so much more attractive." "I'd like to say the name," Mola said dryly, "but I've never known any—" "Oh, I'd like to say the same," Mola said dryly, "but I've never known any educated men." I bent down and picked up a pinch of ash from the fire pit, then dusted it over the back of my hand where it absorbed the blood. "That should work," Fela said. "This flesh will burn. To ash all things return," Willem intoned in a somber voice, then turned to Simmon. "Isn't that what it says in your holy book?" "It's not my holy book," Simmon said, "but you're close. To ash all things return, so too this flesh will burn." "You two are certainly enjoying yourselves," Mola observed dryly. "I am giddy thinking of a full night's sleep," Willem said. "An evening's entertainment is coffee after cake." Fela held out the blob of soft wax, and I pressed the wet ash into it. She kneaded it again, then began to mold it, her fingers patting it into a man-shaped doll in a few deft motions. She held it out for the group to see. "Kvat's head is way bigger than that," Simmon said with his boyish grin. "I also have genitals," I said as I took the moment from Fela and fixed a hair to the top of its head. But at a certain point, realism becomes unproductive. I walked over to Sim and handed him both the simulacrum and the long hat pin. He took one in each hand, looking uneasily back and forth between them. "You sure about this?" I nodded. "Fair enough." Sim drew a deep breath and squared his shoulders. His forehead furrowed in concentration as he stared at the doll. I doubled over, shrieking and clutching at my leg. Fela gasped. Willem leapt to his feet. Simmon went wide-eyed with panic, holding the doll and pin stiff-armed away from each other. He looked wildly at everyone. I didn't—" I straightened up, brushing my shirt. "Just practicing," I said. "Was the scream too girly?" Simmon went limp with relief. "Damn you," he said weakly, laughing. "That's not funny, you bastard." He continued to laugh helplessly as he wiped away the sheen of sweat from his forehead. Willem muttered something in Siaru and returned to his seat. "You three are as good as a traveling troupe," Mola said. Simmon took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He reset his shoulders and brought the doll and the pin up in front of him. His hand shook. "Telu, anyway," he said. "You scared the hell out of me. I can't do this now." "For the love of God!" Mola stood and walked around the fire pit to stand over Simmon. She held out her hands. "Give it to me." She took the mommet and pin and turned to look me in the eye. "Are you ready?" "Just a second." After 2 span of constant vigilance, letting go of the alar that protected me felt like prying open a fist gone stiff from clutching something too long. After a moment, I shook my head. I felt strange without the alar, almost naked. "Don't hold back, but hit me in the leg, just in case." Mola paused, murmured a binding, and drove the pin through the leg of the doll. Silence. Everyone watched me, motionless. I didn't feel a thing. "I'm fine," I said. Everyone started to breathe again as I gave Mola a curious look. "Was that really everything you had?" "No," Mola said frankly as she pulled the pin out of the doll's leg and knelt to hold it over the fire. "That was a gentle test run. I didn't want to listen to your girly scream again." She pulled the pin back out of the fire and stood up. "I'm going to come charging in for real this time." She poised the pin over the doll and looked at me. "You ready?" I nodded. She closed her eyes for a moment, then murmured a binding and stabbed the hot pin through the mommet's leg. The metal of the gram went cool against the inside of my arm, and I felt a brief pressure against my calf muscle, as if someone had prodded me with a finger. I looked down to make sure Simmon wasn't getting some revenge by poking at me with a stick. Because I wasn't watching, I missed what Mola did next, but I felt 3 more dull prods, one in each arm and the other in the thick muscle just above my knee. The gram grew colder. I heard Fela gasp and looked up in time to see Mola, grim-faced and resolute, toss the mommet into the heart of the campfire, murmuring another binding. As the wax doll arsed through the air, Simmon let out a startled yelp. Willem came to his feet again, almost lunging at Mola, but too late to stop her. The mommet landed among the red coals with an explosion of sparks. My gram went almost painfully cold against my arm, and I laughed crazily. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions in various stages of horror and disbelief. "I'm fine," I said. "This feels really weird, though. It's flickery, like standing in a warm, thick wind." The gram grew icy against my arm, then the odd sensation faded as the doll melted, destroying the sympathetic link. The fire leaped up as the wax began to burn. "Did it hurt?" Simmon asked anxiously. "Not a bit," I said. "And that was everything I had," Mola said. "To do any more I would have had to have a forge fire at my disposal. And she's Eltha," Simmon said smugly. "I'll bet she's 3 times the sympathist Ambrose is." "At least 3 times," I said, "but if anyone was going to go out of their way to find a forge fire, it would be Ambrose. You can overwhelm a gram if you throw enough at it." "So we're going ahead with things tomorrow?" Mola asked. I nodded. "I'd rather be safe than sore." Simmon poked a stick at the spot in the fire where the doll had landed. "If Mola can do her worst and it just rolls off you, it might be enough to keep Devi off your back, too. Give you some breathing room." There was a brief moment of silence. I held my breath, hoping Fela and Mola wouldn't take any particular note of his comment. Mola raised an eyebrow at me. "Devi?" I glared at Simmon, and he gave me a piteous look, like a dog that knows it's going to be kicked. "I borrowed some money from a Gaelet named Devi," I said, hoping she'd be satisfied with that. Mola continued to look at me. "And?" I sighed. Ordinarily I would have avoided the subject, but Mola tended to be insistent about this sort of thing, and I desperately needed her help for tomorrow's plan. "Devi used to be a member of the Arcanum," I explained. "I gave her some of my blood as collateral for a loan at the beginning of the term. When Ambrose started attacking me, I jumped to the wrong conclusion and accused her of malfeasance. Our relationship went sour after that." Mola and Fela exchanged a look. "You do go out of your way to make life exciting, don't you?" Mola said. "I already admitted it was a mistake," I said, irritated. "What else do you want from me?" "Are you going to be able to pay her back?" Fela interjected into the conversation before things became heated between Mola and me. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "With a few lucky breaks and some long nights in the fishery, I might be able to scrape enough together by the end of the term." I didn't mention the whole truth. While I might have a chance of earning enough to pay Debbie back, I wouldn't have a chance in hell of making my tuition at the same time. I didn't want to spoil everyone's evening with the fact that Ambrose had won. By forcing me to spend so much time hunting for a gram, he'd effectively driven me out of the university. Fela tilted her head to one side. "What happens if you can't pay her?" "Nothing good," Willem said darkly. "They don't call her Demon Devi for nothing." "I'm not sure," I said. "She could sell my blood. She said she knew someone willing to buy it." "I'm sure she wouldn't do that," Fela said. "I wouldn't blame her," I said. "I knew what I was getting into when I made the deal." "But it's just the way the world works," I said firmly, not wanting to dwell on it any more than necessary. I wanted the evening to end on a positive note. "I, for one, am looking forward to a good night's sleep in my own bed." I looked around to see Will and Sim nodding weary agreement. "I'll see everyone tomorrow. Don't be late." Later that night, I slept in the luxury of my narrow bed in my tiny room. At some point I stirred awake, dragged into consciousness by the sensation of chill metal against my skin. I smiled, rolled over, and slid back into blissful sleep. "Oh, hi, Rule. Thank you. Happy Friday to you, too. And yes, go Gauchos. Woo! UCSB. Can't believe it'll be 10 years this year since I graduated. It's nuts." Catching up on comments here. Okay, chapter 33, Fire. As I drink water. I packed my travel sack carefully the next evening, anxious that I might forget some key piece of equipment. I was checking everything a third time when there was a knock on the door. I opened it to see a young boy of 10 or so standing there, breathing hard. His eyes darted to my hair, and he looked relieved. "Are you Koeth?" "Kvoth," I said, "and yes, I am." "I got a message for you." He reached into a pocket and pulled out a bedraggled piece of paper. I held out my hand, and the boy took a step back, shaking his head. "The lady said you'd give me a jot for bringing it to you." "I doubt that," I said, holding out my hand. "Let me see the note. I'll give you halfpenny if it's really for me." The boy scowled and grudgingly handed it over. It wasn't even sealed, just folded over twice. It was also vaguely damp. Looking at the sweat-soaked boy, I could guess why. It read, "Kvoth, your presence is graciously requested for dinner tonight. I've missed you. I have exciting news. Please meet me at the Barrel and Boar at 5th Bell. Yours, Denna. Postscript. I promised the boy halfpenny." 5th bell? I demanded. God's black hands! That's a new one. How long did you take to get here? It's past 6th bell already. It's past 6th bell already. That ain't my fault, he said, scowling fiercely. I've been looking all over for hours. Anchors, she said. Take it to Coath at Anchors on the other side of the river. But this place ain't the docks at all, and there ain't any anchors on the sign outside. How's a one supposed to find this place? You ask someone, I shouted. Black damn, boy, how thick are you? I fought down a very real urge to strangle him and took a deep breath. I looked out the window at the fading light. In less than half an hour my friends would be gathering around the fire pit in the woods. I didn't have time for a trip to Imra. Right, I said as calmly as I could manage. I dug out a stub of pencil and scratched out a note on the other side of the piece of paper. Denna, I'm terribly sorry. Your runner didn't find me until past 6th bell. He is unutterably thick. I have missed you as well, and offer to put myself entirely at your disposal at any hour of the day or night tomorrow. Send the boy back with your response to let me know when and where. Fondly, Cloth. Postscript. If the boy tries to get any money off you, give him a sharp cuff round the ear. He'll get his money when he returns your note to Anchors, assuming he doesn't get confused and eat it along the way. I folded it over again and pressed a blob of soft candle wax over the fold. I felt my purse. Over the last month I'd slowly burned through the extra 2 talents I'd borrowed from Devi. I'd squandered the money on luxuries like bandages, coffee, and the materials for tonight's plan. Those sound like Danny Pooty luxuries. As a result, all I had to my name was 4 pennies and a lonely shim. I shouldered my travel sack and motioned for the boy to follow me downstairs. I nodded to Anchor standing behind the bar, then turned to the boy. Okay, I said. You bollocksed things up getting here, but I'm going to give you a chance to make it right. I pulled out 3 pennies and held them out for him to see. You head back to the Barrel and Boar, find the woman who sent you, and you give her this. I held up the note. She'll send back a reply. You bring it here and give it to him. I pointed to Anchor. And he'll give you the money. I ain't an idiot, the boy said. I want halfpenny first. I ain't an idiot either, I said. You'll get 3 whole pennies when you bring her note back. He glared at me, then nodded sullenly. I handed him the note, and he ran out the door. Boy seemed a little addled when he came in here, Anchor said. I shook my head. He's witless as a sheep, I said. I wouldn't use him at all, but he knows what she looks like. I sighed and put the 3 pennies on the bar. You'd be doing me a favor if you read the note to make sure the boy isn't faking. Anchor gave me a bit of an uncomfortable look. And what if it's of an, personal nature? Then I'll dance a merry little jig, I said. But between the 2 of us, I hardly think that's likely. The sun had set by the time I made it into the forest. Oh yeah, I miss Freebirds too. So God is black in this book. I mean, I would hope so. Otherwise, that's kind of a weird thing to say. Like, just his hands are black? I don't know. Okay, the sun had set by the time I made it into the forest. Willem was already there, kindling a fire in the wide pit. We worked together for a quarter hour, gathering enough wood to keep a bonfire burning for hours. Simmon arrived a few minutes later, dragging a long section of dead branch. The 3 of us broke it into pieces and made nervous small talk until Fela came out of the trees. Her long hair was pinned up, leaving her elegant neck and shoulders bare. Her eyes were dark, and her mouth was slightly redder than usual. Her long black gown was gathered close at her narrow waist and well-rounded hips. She was also displaying the most spectacular pair of breasts I'd ever seen at that point in my young life. We all gaped, but Simmon gaped openly. Wow, he said. I mean, you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen before this. I didn't think there was any further for you to go. He laughed his boyish laugh and gestured at her with both hands. Look at you. You're incredible. Fela flushed and looked away, obviously pleased. You have the hardest part tonight, I said to her. I hate to ask, but you're the only irresistibly attractive woman we know, Simmon chimed in. Our backup plan was to stuff Willem into a dress. Nobody wants that. Willem nodded. Agreed. Only for you. Fela's mouth quirked into an ironic smile. When I said I owed you a favor, I never guessed you'd ask me to go out on a date with another man. The smile went a little sour. Especially Ambrose. You only need to put up with him for an hour or 2. Try to get him into Imra if you can, but anywhere at least 100 yards from the pony will do. Fela sighed. At least I'll get dinner out of this. She looked at Simmon. I like your boots. He grinned. They're new. I turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Mola was the only one of us not here, but I heard murmured voices mixed with the footsteps and gritted my teeth. It was probably a pair of young lovers out enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. The group of us couldn't be seen together, not tonight. It would raise too many questions. I was just about to rush out to intercept them when I recognized Mola's voice. "Just wait here while I explain," she said. "Please, just wait. It will make things easier." "Let him pitch a 12-color fit," a familiar female voice came out of the darkness. "Let him shit out his liver for all I care." I stopped in my tracks. I knew the second voice, but I couldn't put my finger on who it belonged to. Mola emerged from the dark trees. At her side was a small figure with short strawberry blonde hair. Debbie. I stood stunned as Mola came closer, holding out her hands in a placating gesture and speaking quickly. "Quoth, I know Debbie from a long while ago. She showed me the ropes back when I was new here. Back before she left." "Expelled," Debbie said proudly. "I'm not ashamed of it." Mola continued hurriedly. "After what you said yesterday, it seemed like there was some misunderstanding. When I stopped in to ask her about it," she shrugged, "the whole story kind of came out. She wanted to help." "I want a piece of Ambrose," Debbie said. There was a weight of cold fury in her voice when she said his name. "My help is largely incidental." Willem cleared his throat. "Would we be correct in assuming—" "He beats his whores," Debbie said, interrupting him abruptly. "And if I could kill the arrogant bastard and get away with it, I would have done it years ago." She stared flatly at Willem. "And yes, we have a past. And no, it's none of your business. Is that enough reason for you?" There was a tense silence. Willem nodded, his face carefully blank. Debbie turned to look at me. "Debbie," I made a short bow to her. "I'm sorry." She blinked in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "Maybe you do have half a brain in your head." "I didn't think I could trust you," I said. "I was wrong, and I regret it. It wasn't the clearest thinking I've ever done." She eyed me for a long moment. "We're not friends," she said curtly, her expression still icy. "But if you're still alive at the end of all this, we'll talk." Debbie looked past me, and her expression softened. "Little Fela." She brushed past me and gave Fela a hug. "You're all grown up." She stepped back and held Fela at arm's length, looking her over appreciatively. "My lord, you look like a 10-stripe Modigan whore. He'll love it." Fela smiled and spun a little so the bottom of her dress flared. "It's nice to have an excuse to dress up every once in a while." "You should be dressing up on your own," Debbie said, "and for better men than Ambrose." "I've been busy. I'm out of practice preening. It took me an hour to remember how to do my hair. Any advice?" She held her arms out to her sides and did a slow turn. Debbie looked her up and down with a calculating eye. "You're already better than he deserves. But you're all bare. Why don't you have any sparkle on you?" Fela looked down at her hands. "Rings won't work with the gloves," she said, "and I didn't have anything nice enough to go with the dress." "Here, then." Debbie tilted her head and reached up under her hair, first on one side, then the other. Then she stepped closer to Fela. "Lord, you're tall. Bend down." When Fela straightened up again, she was wearing a pair of earrings that swung and caught the light of the fire. Debbie stepped back and gave an exasperated sigh. "And they look better on you, of course." She shook her head with irritation. "Good Lord, woman, if I had tits like yours, I'd own half the world by now." "You and me both," Sim said enthusiastically. Willem burst out laughing, then covered his face and stepped away from Sim, shaking his head and doing his best to look like he didn't have the slightest idea who was standing next to him. Debbie looked at Sim's unashamed, boyish grin, then back to Fela. "Who's the idiot?" I caught Mola's eye and motioned her closer so we could talk. "You didn't need to, but thanks. It's a relief knowing she's not out there plotting against me." "Don't assume," Mola said grimly. "I've never seen her so angry. It just seemed a shame for the two of you to be at odds. You're a lot alike." I darted a glance across the fire pit where Will and Sim were cautiously approaching Debbie and Fela. "I've heard a lot about you," Willem said, looking at Debbie. "I thought you'd be taller." "How's that working out for you?" Debbie asked dryly. "Thinking, I mean." I waved my hands to get everyone's attention. "It's late," I said. "We have to get into position." Fela nodded. "I want to be there early, just in case." She straightened her gloves nervously. "Wish me luck." Mola walked over and gave her a quick hug. "It'll be fine. Stay somewhere in public with him. He'll behave better if people are watching." "Keep asking him about his poetry," Debbie advised. He'll talk the time away." "If he gets impatient, compliment the wine," Mola added. "Say things like, 'Oh, I'd love another glass, but I'm worried it'd go right to my head.' He'll buy a bottle and try to pour it into you." Debbie nodded. "It'll keep him off you for an extra half-hour at least." She reached out and pulled up the top of Fela's dress a bit. "Start conservative, then bring them out a little more toward the end of the dinner. Lean. Use your shoulders. If he keeps seeing more and more, he'll think he's getting somewhere. It'll keep him from getting grabby." "This is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen," Willem said quietly. Do all the women in the world secretly know each other? Sim asked. Because that would explain a lot. There's barely 100 of us in the Arcanum, Debbie said scathingly. They confine us to a single wing of the Muse, whether or not we actually want to live there. How can we not know each other? Excuse me. I walked over to Fela and handed her a slender oak twig. I'll signal you when we're done. You signal me if he walks out on you. Fela arched an eyebrow. A woman could take that slightingly, she said, then smiled and slid the twig inside one of her long black gloves. Her earrings swung and caught the light again. They were emeralds, smooth emerald teardrops. Those are lovely earrings, I said to Debbie. Where did you come by them? Her eyes narrowed as if she were trying to decide whether or not to take offense. A pretty young boy used them to settle his debt, she said. Not that it's any of your business. I shrugged. Just curious. Fela waved and walked off, but before she made it 10 feet, Simmon caught up with her. He smiled awkwardly, talking and making a few emphatic gestures before handing her something. She smiled and tucked it into her long black glove. I turned to Debbie. I assume you know the plan. She nodded. How far is it to his room? A little more than half a mile, I said apologetically. The slippage... Debbie cut me off with a gesture. I do my own calculations, she said sharply. Right. I gestured to where my travel sack lay near the edge of the fire pit. There's wax and clay in there. I handed her a slim birch twig. I'll signal you when we're in position. Start with the wax. Give it a hard half hour, then signal and move on to the clay. Give the clay at least an hour. Debbie snorted. With a bonfire behind me? It'll take me 15 minutes tops. It might not be tucked into his sock drawer, you realize. It might be locked away without much air. Debbie waved me away. I know my business. I made a half bow. I'll leave it in your capable hands. That's it? Mola demanded indignantly. You lectured me for an hour. You quizzed me. There isn't time, I said simply, and you'll be here to coach her if need be. Besides, Debbie happens to be one of the handful of people I suspect might be a better sympathist than me. Debbie gave me a dark look. Suspect? I beat you like a red-headed stepchild. You were my little sympathy hand puppet. That was 2 span ago, I said. I've learned a lot since then. Hand puppet? Sim asked Willem. Will made an explanatory gesture, and they both burst out laughing. I motioned to Willem. Let's go. Before we could head out, Sim handed me a small jar. I gave it an odd look. I already had this alchemical concoction tucked away in my cloak. Or his alchemical concoction. What's this? It's just ointment in case you get burned, he explained. But if you mix it with piss, it turns into candy. Sim's expression was deadpan. Delicious candy. I nodded seriously. Yes, sir. Mola stared in confusion. Debbie pointedly ignored us and began piling wood on the fire. Yeah, fun group. An hour later, Willem and I were playing cards at the Golden Pony. The common room was nearly full, and a harpist was doing a passable version of Sweet Winter Rye. The room was full of murmured conversation as wealthy customers gambled, drank, and talked about whatever rich people talk about. How to properly beat the stable boy, I guessed, or techniques for chasing the chambermaid around the estate. The Golden Pony was not my sort of place. The clientele was too well-bred, the drinks too expensive, and the musicians more pleasing to the eye than the ear. Despite all this, I'd been coming here for nearly 2 span, making a show of trying to climb the social ladder. That way no one could say it was odd I was here on this particular night. That's what I was wondering too, like, oh, he went like up 10 levels or something in a few days. Willem took a drink and shuffled the cards. My own drink sat half-finished and warm. It was only a simple ale, but given the prices at the Pony, I was now quite literally penniless. Will dealt another hand of breath. I picked up my cards carefully as Simmons' alchemical concoction made my fingers ever so slightly sticky. We might as well have been playing with blank cards. I drew and threw randomly, pretending to concentrate on the game, when really I was waiting, listening. I felt a slight tickle in the corner of my eye and reached to rub it away with my fingers, catching myself at the last second with my hand upraised. Willem stared at me from across the table, his eyes alarmed, and gave his head a small, firm shake. I went motionless for a moment, then slowly lowered my hand. I was so busy trying to appear nonchalant that when the cry came from outside I was actually startled. It cut through the low murmur of conversation, as only a shrill voice filled with panic can. Fire! Fire! Everyone in the Pony froze for a moment. This always happens when people are startled and confused. They take a second to look around, smell the air, and think things like, did he just say fire? Or, fire? Where? Here? I didn't hesitate. I leapt to my feet and made a show of looking around wildly, obviously trying to search out the fire. By the time everyone else in the common room started to move, I was already dashing for the stairs. "Fire!" the cries continued from outside. "Oh, God! Fire!" I smiled as I listened to Basil overact his small part. I didn't know him well enough to let him in on the whole plan, but it was vital that someone notice the fire early so I could spring into action. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally burn down half the inn. I reached the top of the steps and looked around the upper floor of the Golden Pony. There were already footsteps pounding up the stairs behind me. A few wealthy lodgers opened their doors, peering into the hallway. There were faint wisps of smoke curling underneath the door to Ambrose's rooms. Perfect. "I think it's over here," I shouted, sliding a hand into one of my cloak's pockets as I ran to the door. In the long days we spent searching the archives, I'd found reference to a great many interesting pieces of artificery. One of them was an elegant piece of artificery called a siege stone. It worked on the most basic sympathetic principles. A crossbow stores energy and uses it to shoot a bolt a long distance at a great speed. A siege stone is an inscribed piece of lead that stores energy and uses it to move itself about 6 inches with the force of a battering ram. Reaching the middle of the hallway, I braced myself and charged Ambrose's door with my shoulder. I also struck it with the siege stone. That was the siege stone I held concealed against the flat of my hand. The thick-timbered door staved in like a barrel struck by an anvil hammer. There were startled gasps and exclamations from everyone in the hallway. I rushed inside, trying desperately to keep the manic grin off my face. Ambrose's sitting room was dark, and made darker by a haze of smoke in the air. I saw flickering firelight inside, off to the left. From my previous visit, I knew it was his bedroom. "Hello?" I shouted. "Is everyone all right?" I pitched my voice carefully, bold but concerned. No panic, of course. I was, after all, the hero of this scene. Smoke was thick in the bedroom, catching the orange firelight and stinging in my eyes. There was a massive wooden chest of drawers against the wall, big as a workbench in the fishery. Flames licked and flickered around the edges of the drawers. Apparently Ambrose had been keeping the mommet in his sock drawer. I picked up a nearby chair and used it to smash the window I'd climbed through several nights ago. "Clear the street!" I shouted down. The bottommost left drawer seemed to be burning the hottest, and when I pulled it open, the smoldering clothes inside caught the air hungrily and burst into flame. I smelled burning hair and hoped I hadn't lost my eyebrows. I didn't want to spend the next month looking constantly surprised. After the initial flare-up, I drew a deep breath, stepped forward, and pulled the heavy wooden drawer free of the bureau with my bare hands. It was full of smoldering blackened cloth, but as I ran to the window I could hear something hard in the bottom of the drawer rattling against the wood. It tumbled as I threw it out the window, clothes bursting into flame as the wind caught them. Next I yanked out the top right-hand drawer. As soon as I pulled it free, smoke and flame poured out in an almost solid mass. With these 2 drawers gone, all the empty space inside the bureau formed a crude chimney, giving the fire all the air it wanted. As I heaved the second drawer out the window, I could actually hear the hollow rush of fire spreading through the varnished wood and the clothes inside. Down in the street, people drawn by the commotion were doing their best to put out the flaming debris. In the middle of the small crowd, Simmon stomped about in his new hobnail boots, smashing things to flinders like a boy splashing in puddles after the first spring rain. Even if the mommet had survived the fall, it wouldn't survive that. This was more than mere pettiness. Devi had signaled me 20 minutes ago, letting me know she'd already tried the wax mommet. Since there had been no result, it meant Ambrose had undoubtedly used my blood to make a clay mommet of me. A simple fire wasn't going to destroy it. One by one, I grabbed the other drawers and threw them into the street as well, pausing to pull down the thick velvet curtains around Ambrose's bed to shield my hands from the heat of the fire. This also might seem petty, but it wasn't. I was terrified of burning my hands. Every talent I had revolved around them. Petty was when I kicked the chamber pot on my way back to the bureau. It was the expensive kind, fine glazed pottery. It tipped over and rolled crazily across the floor until it struck the hearth and shattered. Suffice to say that what spilled across Ambrose's rugs was not delicious candy. Flame flickered openly in the spaces where the drawers had been, lighting the room while the broken window let in some clear air. Eventually, someone else was brave enough to make their way into the room. He used one of the blankets off Ambrose's bed to protect his hands and helped me throw the last several burning drawers out the window. It was hot, sooty work, and even with the help, I was coughing by the time the last of the drawers went tumbling onto the street. It was over in less than 3 minutes. A few quick-thinking bar patrons brought in pitchers of water and doused the still-burning frame of the empty bureau. I tossed the smoldering velvet drapes out the window, shouting, Look out down there!" so Simmon would know to retrieve my siege stone from the pile of tangled cloth. Lamps were lit, and the smoke thinned as cool night air blew in through the broken window. People filtered into the room to help, or gawk, or gossip. A cluster of amazed onlookers gathered around Ambrose's staved-in door, and I idly wondered what sort of rumors might spring out of tonight's performance. Once the room was properly lit, I marveled at the damage the fire had done. The chest of drawers was little more than a collection of charred sticks, and the plaster wall behind it was cracked and blistered from the heat. The white ceiling was painted with a wide fan of black soot. I caught my reflection in the dressing-room mirror and was pleased to see my eyebrows were more or less intact. I was mightily disheveled, my hair in disarray and my face smudged with sweat and dark ash. The whites of my eyes looked very bright against the black of my face. Willem joined me and helped bandage up my left hand. It wasn't really burned, but I knew it would look odd if I walked away entirely unscathed. Aside from a little lost hair, my worst injury was actually the holes charred in my long sleeves. Another shirt ruined. If this kept up, I'd be naked by the end of the term. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched as people brought more water to splash on the bureau. I pointed out a charred ceiling beam, and they doused it too, sending up a sharp hiss and a cloud of steam and smoke. People continued to wander in and out, looking at the wreckage and muttering to each other while shaking their heads. Just as Will was finishing my bandage, the sound of galloping hooves on cobblestones came through the broken window, temporarily overwhelming the noise of fiercely stomping hobnailed boots. Less than a minute later, I heard Ambrose in the hallway. "What in the name of God is going on here? Get out! Out!" Cursing and shoving people aside, Ambrose made his entrance. When he saw me sitting on his bed, he pulled up short. "What are you doing in my rooms?" he demanded. "What?" I asked, then looked around. "These are your rooms?" Keeping the proper amount of dismay in my tone wasn't easy, as my voice was rough with smoke. "I just burned myself, saving your things?" Ambrose's eyes narrowed, then went to the charred wreckage of his bureau. His eyes flicked back to me, then went wide with sudden realization. I fought the urge to grin. "Get out of here, you filthy, thieving rua!" he spat venomously. "I swear if anything's missing, I'll bring the constable down on you. I'll have you on the iron law and see you hanged." I drew a breath to respond, then started to cough uncontrollably and had to settle for glaring at him. "Good job, Ambrose," Willem said sarcastically. "You caught him. He stole your fire." One of the onlookers chimed in. "Yeah, make him put it back." "Get out!" Ambrose shouted, red-faced and furious. "And take that filthy shim with you, or I'll give you both the thrashing you deserve." I watched the bystanders stare at Ambrose, appalled by his behavior. I gave him a long, proud look, playing the scene for all it was worth. "You're welcome," I said with injured dignity, and shouldered past him, jostling him roughly out of the way. As I was leaving, a fat, florid man in a waistcoat staggered through the ruined door to Ambrose's rooms. I recognized him as the owner of the Golden Pony. "What the devil's been going on here?" he demanded. "Candles are dangerous things," I said. I looked over my shoulder and met Ambrose's eye. "Honestly, boy," I said to him, "I don't know what you were thinking. You'd think a member of the Arcanum would have more sense." Will, Mola, Devi, and I were sitting around what was left of the bonfire when we heard the crackle of footsteps coming through the trees. Fela was still dressed elegantly, but her hair was unpinned. Sim was making his way carefully alongside her, absent-mindedly holding branches out of her way as they moved through the undergrowth. "And just where have you two been?" Devi asked. "I had to walk back from Imra," Fela explained. "Sim came to meet me halfway. Don't worry, Mother, he was a perfect gentleman." "I hope it wasn't too bad for you," I said. "Dinner was about what you would expect," Fela admitted. But the second part made it all worthwhile." "Second part?" Mola asked. "On our way back, Sim took me to see the wreckage at the pony. I stopped to have a word with Ambrose. I've never had so much fun." Fela's smile was wicked. "It was perfect. I was perfectly huffy." "She was," Simmon said. "It was brilliant." Fela faced Sim and set her hands on her hips. "Run off on me, will you?" Sim screwed his face up into an exaggerated scowl and gestured wildly. "Listen to me, you daft bint," he said in a fair imitation of Ambrose's vintage accent. My rooms were on fire." Fela turned away, throwing up her hands. "Don't lie to me! You ran off to be with some whore! I've never been so humiliated in my life! I never want to see you again!" We applauded. Fela and Sim linked arms and took a bow. "In the interest of pure accuracy," Fela said in an offhand way, "Ambrose didn't use the words daft bint." She didn't let go of Sim's arm. Simmon looked a little embarrassed. "Yes, well, there are some things you don't call a lady, even in fun." He reluctantly let go of Fela and sat on the trunk of the fallen tree. Fela sat next to him. Fela leaned close to him and whispered something. Sim laughed, shaking his head. "Please?" Fela asked, laying her hand on his arm. "Quoth doesn't have his lute. Someone has to entertain us." Okay, Simmon said, obviously a little flustered. He closed his eyes for a moment, then spoke in a sonorous voice. "First came our Fela, fiery eyes flashing, crossing... Wait, hold on. Okay, I'm making sure I'm reading this right, because it's, like, in a weird configuration. Fast came Orfella, fiery eyes flashing, crossing the cobbles, strength in her stride. Came she to Ambrose, all ashes around him. Grim was his gazing, fearsome his frown. Still Fella feared not. Brave was her Simmon came to an abrupt stop before saying the word bosom, and blushed red as a beet. Devi gave an earthy chuckle from where she sat on the other side of the fire. Ever the good friend, Willem stepped in with a distracting question. "What is that pause you keep doing?" he asked. "It's like you can't catch your breath." "I asked that too," Fella said, smiling. "It's something they use in Eldvintic verse," Sim explained. "It's a break in the line called a caesura. That is what was confusing me, the caesura, because it's written. They wrote it out. It's a weird pause. I couldn't tell if it was like, I'm supposed to read, like, the first... It was like this. It's backwards, I know, but... I couldn't tell if I was supposed to read this way and then this way, or read all the way across. I've never seen a break like that. Anyway, I'm just as confused as the characters are. "You are dangerously well informed about poetry, Sim," I said. "I'm close to losing respect for you." "Hush," Fella said. "I think it's lovely. You're just jealous he can do it off the cuff." "Poetry is a song without music," I said loftily. "A song without music is like a body without a soul." Willem raised his hand before Simmon could respond. "Before we become mired in philosophical talk, I have a confession to make," Willem said somberly. "I dropped a poem in the hallway outside Ambrose's rooms. It was an acrostic that spoke of his powerful affection for Master Hem." We all laughed, but Simmon seemed to find it particularly funny. It took him a long while to catch his breath. "It couldn't be more perfect if we planned it," he said. "I bought a few pieces of women's clothing and scattered them in with what was out on the street. Red satin, lacy bits, a whalebone corset." There was more laughter. Then they turned their eyes to me. "And what did you do?" Debbie prompted. "Only what I set out to," I said somberly. "Only what was necessary to destroy the Mommet so I could sleep safe at night." "You kicked over his chamber pot," Willem said. "True," I admitted. "And I found this." I held up a piece of paper. "If that's one of his poems," Debbie said, "I'd suggest you burn it quickly and wash your hands." I unfolded the slip of paper and read it out loud. "Ledger mark 4535, ring, white gold, blue smokestone, remount setting and polish." I folded it carefully and put it in a pocket. "To me," I said, "this is better than a poem." Sim sat upright. "Is that a pawn slip for your lady's ring?" "It's a claim slip for a jeweler, and if I don't miss my guess. But yes, it's for her ring," I said. "And she's not my lady, by the way." "I'm lost," Debbie said. "That's how this all started," Willem said. "Kvoth was trying to reclaim a bit of property for a girl he fancies." "Someone should fill me in," Debbie said. "I seem to have come in halfway through the story." I leaned back against a piece of fieldstone, content to let my friends tell the story. The slip of paper hadn't been in Ambrose's chest of drawers. It hadn't been on the hearth or his bedside table. It hadn't been on his jewelry tray or his writing desk. It had, in fact, been in Ambrose's purse. I'd lifted it off him in a fit of pique half a minute after he called me a filthy, thieving roof. It had almost been a reflex action as I'd brushed roughly past him on my way out of his rooms at the Pony. By strange coincidence, the purse also contained money, almost 6 talents. Not a great deal of coin as far as Ambrose was concerned. Enough for an extravagant night out with a lady, but for me it was a great deal of money, so much I almost felt guilty for taking it. Almost. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is a short chapter next. And then I can probably read one or two more. Chapter 34, Baubles. There was no note for me from Denna when I returned to Anchors that night. Nor was there one waiting in the morning. I wondered if the boy had ever found her with my message, or if he had simply given up, or dropped it in the river, or eaten it. The next morning I decided my mood was too good to spoil it with the inevitable madness of Elodin's class, so I shouldered my lute and headed over the river to look for Denna. It had taken longer than I had planned, but I was eager to see the look on her face when I finally returned her ring. I walked into the jeweler's and smiled at the small man standing behind a low display case. Are you finished with the ring? His forehead creased. I beg your pardon, sir? I sighed and dug around in my pocket, eventually producing the slip of paper. He peered at it, then his face lit with understanding. Ah, yes, of course. Just a moment. He made his way through a door into the back of the shop. I relaxed a bit. This was the third shop I'd visited. The other conversations hadn't worked out nearly this well. The tiny man bustled out of the back room. Here we are, sir. He held up the ring. Right as rain again. Lovely stone, too, if you don't mind my saying. I held it to the light. It was Denna's ring. You do good work, I said. He smiled at this. Thank you, sir. All told, the work came to 45 pennies. I gave a small, silent sigh. It had been too much to hope that Ambrose had paid for the work in advance. I juggled numbers in my head and counted a talent and 6 jots onto the glass top of the display case. As I did, I noticed it had the slightly oily texture of twice-tough glass. I ran my hand over it, wondering idly if it was one of the pieces I had made at the fishery. As the jeweler gathered up the coins, I noticed something else. Something inside the case. A bauble caught your eye? He asked smoothly. I pointed at the necklace in the center of the case. At a necklace in the center of the case. You have excellent taste, he said, pulling out a key and unlocking a panel in the back of the case. This is quite an exceptional piece. Not only is the setting elegant, but the stone itself is remarkably fine. You don't often see an emerald of this quality cut in a long drop. Is it your work? I asked. The jeweler gave a dramatic sigh. Alas, I cannot claim that distinction. A young woman brought it in several span ago. She had more need of money than adornment, it seems, and we came to an arrangement. How much would you like for it? I asked as casually as possible. He told me. It was a staggering amount of money. More money than I had ever seen in one place. Enough money that a woman... Jesus, what was that about? My cat is jumpy. Enough money that a woman might live comfortably in Imra for several years. Enough money for a fine new harp. Enough for a lute of solid silver, or if she desired, a case for such a lute. The jeweler sighed again, shaking his head at the sad state of the world. It is a shame, he said. Who can tell what drives young women to do such things? Then he looked up and smiled, holding the teardrop emerald to the light with an expectant expression. Still, her loss is your gain. Since Denna had mentioned the barrel and bore in her note, I decided to start looking for her there. My lute case hung heavier on my shoulder now that I knew what she'd given up to pay for it. Still, one good turn deserves another, and I hoped the return of her ring would help balance things between us. But the barrel and bore wasn't an inn, merely a restaurant. Without any real hope, I asked the host if someone might have left a message for me. Nobody had. I asked if he remembered a woman who had been there the night before, dark-haired, lovely. He nodded at that. She waited for a long while, he said. I remember thinking, who would keep a woman like that waiting? You would be amazed at how many inns and boarding houses there are, and even in a smallish city like Imra. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and read one more and then call it, because this one's kind of short too. Is it? Yeah, this one's short. Chapter 35, Secrets. Two days later, I was heading off to the fishery, hoping some honest work would clear my head and make me better able to tolerate 2 hours of Illidan's jackassery. I was 3 steps from the door when I saw a young girl in a blue cloak hurrying across the courtyard toward me. Underneath the hood, her face was a startling mix of excitement and anxiety. We made eye contact, and she stopped moving toward me. Then, still eyeing me, she made a motion so furtive and stiff I couldn't understand what she meant until she repeated it. She wanted me to follow her. Puzzled, I nodded. She turned and walked out of the courtyard, moving with the awkward stiffness of someone trying desperately to be nonchalant. I followed her. Under other circumstances, I would have thought she was a shill luring me into a dark alley where thugs would kick out my teeth and take my purse. But there weren't any decently dangerous alleys this close to the university, and it was a sunny afternoon besides. Eventually, she stepped into a deserted piece of road behind a glass blower and a clocksmith's shop. She looked around nervously, then turned, her face beaming under the shelter of her hood. I finally found you, she said breathlessly. She was younger than I'd thought, no more than 14. Curls of mousy brown hair framed her pale face and fought to escape the hood. Still, I couldn't place her. I've had a drummer of a time tracking you down, she said. A drummer of a time. Okay. Interesting expression. I spend so much time here, my ma thinks I have a beau at the university. She said the last almost shyly, her mouth making a tiny curve. I opened my mouth to admit I didn't have the slightest idea who she was, but before I could get a word out, she spoke again. "Don't worry," she said. "I ain't letting anyone know I was coming to see you." Her bright eyes went dark with anxiety, like a pool when the sun goes behind a cloud. "I know it's safer that way." It was only when her face went dark with worry that I recognized her. She was the young girl I'd met in Trebon when I'd gone to investigate rumors of the Chandrian. "Nina," I said, "what are you doing here?" "Looking for you." She thrust out her chin proudly. "I knew you must be from here, 'cause you knew all sorts of magic." She looked around. "But it's bigger than I thought it would be. I know you didn't give anyone in Trebon your name because then they'd have power over you, but I have to say it makes you terribly hard to find." Had I not told anyone my name in Trebon? Some of my memories of that time were vague, as I'd had a bit of a concussion. It was probably for the best I'd kept myself anonymous, given that I'd been responsible for burning down a sizable portion of the town. "I'm sorry to put you to so much work," I said, still not sure what this was all about. Nina took a step closer. "I had dreams after you left," she said, her voice low and confidential. "Bad dreams. I thought they were coming for me because of what I told you." She gave me a meaningful look. "But then I started sleeping with the amulet you gave me. I made my prayers every night, and the dreams went away." One of her hands absent-mindedly fingered a piece of bright metal that hung around her neck on a leather cord. I realized with sudden guilt that I had inadvertently lied to Master Kilvin. I hadn't sold anyone a charm, or even made anything that would look like one, but I had given Nina an engraved piece of metal I told her was an amulet to set her mind at ease. Before that, she'd been on the edge of nervous hysteria, worried that demons were going to kill her. "So it's been working then?" I asked, trying not to sound guilty. She nodded. "As soon as I had it under my pillow and said my prayers, I slept like a babe at the tit. Then I started having my special dream," she said, and smiled up at me. "I dreamed about the big pot Jimmy showed me before those folks were killed up at the Moth and Farm." I felt hope rise in my chest. Nina was the only person alive who had seen the ancient piece of pottery. It had been covered with pictures of the Chandrian, and they are jealous of their secrets. "You remembered something about the pot with the 7 people painted on it?" I asked excitedly. She hesitated for a moment, frowning. "There was 8 of them," she said, "not 7. "8?" I asked. "Are you sure?" She nodded earnestly. "I thought I told you before." The rising hope in my chest suddenly fell into the pit of my stomach, where it lay heavy and sour. There were 7 Chandrian. It was one of the few things I knew for certain about them. If there were 8 people on the painted vase Nina had seen... Nina continued to chatter away, unaware of my disappointment. "I dreamed about the pot for 3 nights in a row," she said, "and it weren't a bad dream at all. I woke up all rested and happy every night. I knew then what God was telling me to do." She began to root around in her pockets and brought out a length of polished horn more than a handspan long and big around as my thumb. "I remembered how you were so curious about the pot, but I couldn't tell you anything 'cause I'd only seen it for a moment." She handed me the piece of horn proudly. I looked down at the cylindrical piece of horn in my hands, not sure what I was supposed to do with it. I looked up at her, confused. Nina gave an impatient sigh and took the horn back. She twisted it, removing the end like a cap. "My brother made this for me," she said as she carefully drew a rolled piece of paper of parchment from inside the horn. "Don't worry, he doesn't know what it was for." She handed me the parchment. "It's not very good," she said nervously. My mum lets me help paint the pots, but this is different. It's harder doing people than flowers and designs, and it's hard getting something right that you can only see in your head." I was amazed my hands weren't shaking. "This is what was painted on the vase?" I asked. It's one side of it," she said. "Something round like this, you can only see a third of it when you're looking at it from one side." "So you dreamed of a different side each night?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just this side, 3 nights in a row." I slowly unrolled the piece of paper and instantly recognized the man she had painted. His eyes were pure black. In the background there was a bare tree, and he was standing on a circle of blue with a few wavy lines on it. "That's supposed to be water," she said, pointing. "It's hard to paint water, though. And he's supposed to be standing on it. There were drifts of snow around him, too, and his hair was white. But I couldn't get the white paint to work. Mixing paints for paper is harder than glazes for pots." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was Cinder, the one who had killed my parents. I could see his face in my mind without even trying, without even closing my eyes. I unrolled the paper further. There was a second man, or rather the shape of a man, in a great hooded robe. Inside the cowl of the robe was nothing but blackness. Over his head were 3 moons, a full moon, a half moon, and one that was just a crescent. Next to him were 2 candles. One was yellow with a bright orange flame. The other candle sat underneath his outstretched hand. It was gray with a black flame, and the space around it was smudged and darkened. That's supposed to be shadow, I think, Nina said, pointing to the area under his hand. It was more obvious on the pot. I had to use charcoal for that. I couldn't get it right with paint. I nodded again. This was Haliax, the leader of the Chandrian. When I'd seen him, he had been surrounded by an unnatural shadow. The fires around him had been strangely dimmed, and the cowl of his cloak had been black as the bottom of a well. I finished unrolling the paper, revealing a third figure, larger than the other two. He wore armor and an open-faced helmet. On his chest was a bright insignia that looked like an autumn leaf, red on the outside, brightening to orange near the middle, with a straight black stem. The skin of his face was tan, but the hand he held poised upright was a bright red. His other hand was hidden by a large round object that Nina had somehow managed to color a metallic bronze. I guessed it was his shield. "He's the worst," Nina said, her voice subdued. I looked down at her. Her face looked somber, and I guessed that she'd taken my silence the wrong way. "You shouldn't say that," I said. "You've done a wonderful job." Nina gave a faint smile. "That's not what I meant," she said. "He was hard to do. I got the copper pretty okay here." She touched his shield. "But this red," her finger brushed his upraised hand, "is supposed to be blood. He's got blood all over his hand." She tapped his chest. "And this was brighter, like something burning." I recognized him then. It wasn't a leaf on his chest. It was a tower wrapped in flame. His bloody, outstretched hand wasn't demonstrating something. It was making a gesture of rebuke toward Haliax and the rest. He was holding up his hand to stop them. This man was one of the Emir, one of the Siridae. The young girl shivered and pulled her cloak around herself. "I don't like looking at him even now," she said. "They were awful to look at. But he was the worst. I can't get faces right, but his was terrible grim. He looked so angry. He looked like he was ready to burn down the whole world." "If this is one side," I asked, "do you remember the rest of it?" "Not like this. I remember there was a woman with no clothes on, and a broken sword, and a fire." She looked thoughtful, then shook her head again. "Like I told you, I only saw it for a quick second when Jimmy showed me. I think an angel helped me remember this piece in a dream so I could paint it down and bring it to you." "Nina," I said, "this is really amazing. You really have no idea how incredible this is." Her face lit up again with a smile. "I'm glad of that. I've had a world of trouble making it." "Where did you get the parchment?" I asked, noticing it for the first time. It was actual vellum, high-quality stuff, far better than anything I could afford. "I practiced on some boards at first," she said, "but I knew that wasn't going to work. Plus I knew I'd have to hide it, so I snuck into the church and cut some pages out of their book." She said the last without the faintest hint of self-consciousness. "You cut this out of the Book of the Path?" I asked, somewhat aghast. I'm not particularly religious, but I do have a vestigial sense of propriety, and after so many hours in the archives, the thought of cutting pages out of a book was horrifying to me. Nina nodded easily. It seemed the best thing since an angel gave me the dream, and they can't lock the church up properly at night since you tore off the front of the building and killed that demon." She reached over and brushed at the paper with a finger. "It ain't that hard. All you need to do is take a knife and scrape at it a bit, and all the words come off." She pointed. "I was careful never to scrape off Telu's name, though, or Anden's, or any of the other angels," she added piously. I looked at it more closely and saw it was true. She'd painted the Emir so the words Anden and Ordal rested directly on top of his shoulders, one on each side, almost as if she were hoping the names would weigh him down, or trap him. "Plus, you said I shouldn't tell anyone what I saw," Nina said, "and painting is like telling with pictures instead of words, so I figured it would be safer to use pages from Telu's book, because no demon would ever look at a page of that book, especially one with Telu's name still writ all over it." She looked up at me proudly. "That was cleverly done," I said approvingly. The belling tower began to ring the hour, and Nina's expression flared into sudden panic. "Oh no," she said pitifully. "I should have been back at the docks by now. My mum's going to give me a birching." I laughed, partly because I was utterly amazed by this unexpected piece of luck, and partly at the thought of a young girl brave enough to defy the Chandrian, but still terrified of making her mother angry. Such is the way of the world. "Nina, you've done me a wonderful favor. If you ever need anything, or if you have another dream, you can find me at an inn called Anchors. I play music there." Her eyes went wide. "Is it magic music?" I laughed again. "Some people think so." She looked around nervously. "I really have to go," she said, then waved and took off running toward the river, the wind blowing her hood back as she went. I carefully re-rolled the piece of paper and tucked it back into the hollow piece of horn. My mind spun with what I had just learned. I thought of what I'd heard Haliax say to Cinder all those years ago. Who keeps you safe from the Emir, the Singers, the Sith? After my months of searching, I was fairly certain the archives had held nothing more than fairy stories about the Chandrian. Nobody considered them more real than shamblemen or fairies. But everyone knew about the Emir. They were the bright knights of the Ottoran Empire. They were the strong hand of the church for 200 years. They were the subject of 100 stories and songs. I knew my history. The Emir had been founded by the Tellin Church in the early days of the Ottoran Empire, but the pottery Nina had seen had been much older than that. I knew my history. The Emir had been condemned and disbanded by the church before the empire fell. But I knew the Chandrian were still afraid of them today. It seemed like there was more to the story. Alright, and that's the end of that chapter. Alright, cool. Alright, thanks for watching, and yeah, things just got really interesting there. That's a good place to end. Can't wait to see what happens next. So I'll be back on Sunday night with the next chapter. Alright, good night.